Evelyn sat by the window of her cozy, sunlit living room, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The faint hum of a distant lawnmower drifted through the open window, blending with the soft chirping of birds. At 72 years old, she had come to treasure these quiet moments of stillness, free from the chaos she had known in her younger years. Her life was simple but rich in the ways that mattered. Sunday dinners with her children and grandchildren, the smell of fresh-baked bread from her kitchen, and her beloved garden that bloomed with vibrant roses every spring. Her granddaughter, Olivia, was her pride and joy, a spirited 21-year-old college student who visited every weekend, filling the house with her boundless energy and stories of campus life. Today was one of those days. Evelyn watched with a warm smile as Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, scrolling on her phone with a curiosity only youth could muster. "Grandma, have you ever thought about taking one of those DNA tests?" Olivia asked suddenly, holding up her phone to show an advertisement. "They tell you all about your ancestry, and you can even connect with family members you didn't know you had." Evelyn's heart gave a tiny lurch, but she didn't show it. She forced a light chuckle, brushing the idea aside with a wave of her hand. "Oh, darling, I know where I come from," she replied, her eyes fixed on the steam swirling up from her teacup. "Besides, who needs all that fuss?" But Olivia was persistent, as she always was. "Come on, Grandma, it's fun. I'll order one for both of us. We can compare our results," she said with a grin, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of adventure. Evelyn knew there was no stopping her once she got an idea in her head. "All right, if it'll make you happy," she relented, letting out a small sigh. She figured it would be harmless, just another one of Olivia's projects that would be forgotten by next week. What harm could it do? 2 weeks later, the DNA test kits arrived in small white boxes, sleek and clinical. Olivia tore them open with the enthusiasm of a child unwrapping presents on Christmas morning. Evelyn watched with amusement, feeling a twinge of nostalgia for when Olivia was a little girl who used to race to the Christmas tree in her pajamas. "It's easy, Grandma," Olivia explained, holding up a tiny plastic tube. "You just spit in this, seal it, and mail it back." Evelyn raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Spitting in a tube? Sounds lovely," she muttered, but she did as she was told, chuckling at how ridiculous it all seemed. She sealed the tube, dropped it in a prepaid package, and watched Olivia dash out to mail it off. "Now we wait," Olivia announced, clapping her hands together like she'd just completed an important mission. "In a few weeks, we'll know all about our family history." Evelyn smiled but said nothing. She knew her family history. She knew exactly where she came from. And she knew exactly what she buried, so deeply that she thought it would never surface again. The weeks passed, and life went on as it always did. Evelyn tended to her roses, met with her church knitting group on Wednesdays, and watched her favorite detective shows in the evenings. Occasionally, Olivia would send her a text asking if the DNA results had come in yet. "Not yet," Evelyn would reply, adding a thumbs-up emoji like she'd recently learned to do. Every time she thought about it, though, a quiet unease settled in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like the prickling sensation of standing too close to the edge of something unknown. On a quiet Thursday morning, while chopping vegetables for her famous lentil soup, her phone buzzed on the counter. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked it up. It was a message from Olivia. "They're here, Grandma. Check your email." Evelyn blinked at the message, her hands still slightly damp from the vegetables. Her chest tightened as she realized she'd been holding her breath. "It's just a silly test," she told herself. "It's just going to tell you what you already know." She tapped the email app, her fingers moving slower than usual. There it was. "Your DNA results are ready." The cheerful banner felt out of place, like confetti at a funeral. She hesitated for a long moment, her finger hovering over the email. "Grandma, did you check it?" Olivia's voice startled her as she burst through the front door, kicking off her sneakers in the hallway. Evelyn didn't even have time to answer before Olivia was by her side, peering over her shoulder. "Come on, open it," Olivia chirped, her eyes filled with the thrill of discovery. Evelyn knew there was no turning back now. She tapped the email. It opened to a bright, colorful page with a map showing the regions of her ancestry. "See, Grandma? Look at that." Olivia pointed to the results. "You're 48% Irish, 32% West African, 15% Scandinavian. Wait, what's this?" Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled down to the relatives section. "Possible DNA matches," it read. Evelyn's eyes scanned the list of names. Most were strangers, likely distant cousins she'd never met. But one name stood out. It wasn't a name she'd seen in decades. Her heart stopped. Her vision blurred for a moment, and a cold rush of air seemed to pass right through her. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. Her fingers twitched like she wanted to close the window, but it was too late. Olivia was already tapping on the profile. "Whoa, Grandma, look. It says this person might be a close relative. It says parent-child match." Evelyn felt like the ground had vanished beneath her. Parent-child match. Those words pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat she couldn't quiet. She grabbed the edge of the countertop to steady herself, her knuckles whitening. "Grandma, are you okay?" Olivia's voice was laced with concern. She glanced up from the phone, finally noticing Evelyn's ashen face. "Grandma, what's wrong?" Evelyn blinked slowly, as if waking from a bad dream. She stared at Olivia, her voice quiet but firm. "Olivia," she said slowly, swallowing hard. I think I need to sit down." She walked to the chair by the window, her legs stiff like she was walking against a strong current. She sat, clasping her hands tightly to keep them from shaking. "Grandma, who is that?" Olivia asked, still holding the phone. "Do you know them?" Evelyn didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the distance, eyes glassy and far away, like she was staring into a past only she could see. Slowly, her fingers rose to touch the gold locket she wore around her neck, the one she never took off. Olivia noticed the movement, her brows furrowing in confusion. She'd never seen her grandmother look so small. "Grandma." Olivia knelt beside her, eyes wide with concern. "Who is that person? Are they someone you know?" Evelyn squeezed the locket, feeling the cool metal press into her palm like an anchor. She thought about 50 years ago. She thought about a hospital room with white walls. She thought about the decision she made, a decision that was supposed to stay buried. She never thought it would come back. Her breath was shallow now, each inhale sharp and thin. She felt her past and present colliding like two tectonic plates, the pressure building with every second. "Olivia," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were filled with something Olivia had never seen before, fear. Real, raw fear. "There are some things," Evelyn said, her voice cracking like old wood, "that you bury so deep, you pray they never find their way back." Her eyes met Olivia's, heavy with a meaning Olivia didn't yet understand. But she would. She would understand soon enough. The air in Evelyn's kitchen felt thicker than usual, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer. Olivia was still on the floor, scrolling through the DNA test results with the same wide-eyed curiosity as before. But for Evelyn, it wasn't curiosity anymore. It was dread. The words parent-child match seemed to be seared into her mind, as if they'd been written in fire. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron, a nervous habit she hadn't done in years. Olivia glanced up at her, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing inside her grandmother. "This is wild, Grandma. It's saying you have a kid out there. Like someone you don't even know about." She laughed, the sound light and free, like none of it really mattered. "It's probably a mistake, right? These tests aren't perfect." Olivia chuckled again, eyes still locked on the screen. "Let me see if I can message them. I think I can send them a message right here in the app." "No." Evelyn's voice cracked like a whip. Olivia's head snapped up, startled. She blinked at her grandmother, her phone still in her hand. "Don't," Evelyn said again, her voice calmer this time but no less firm. Her eyes locked onto Olivia with an intensity that wasn't typical of her gentle, easygoing grandmother. Olivia tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "Why not?" she asked, her voice slower now, more cautious. Evelyn opened her mouth to answer, but the words got stuck in her throat. What could she say? How could she explain something she had spent half a century trying to forget? Her gaze dropped to her lap, where her fingers were still twisting the fabric of her apron. Olivia stood slowly, setting the phone on the countertop, her eyes fixed on Evelyn. "Grandma, do you know who this person is?" she asked softly, her voice careful, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched so long that it became its own kind of answer. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat she couldn't control. Her mind was racing, caught between past and present. She glanced at Olivia, who was now watching her with the eyes of someone who was putting the pieces together on her own. "She's too smart for her own good," Evelyn thought bitterly. She could already see the questions forming behind Olivia's eyes. Evelyn's throat felt dry, like she'd swallowed dust. She had to get ahead of this, control it before it spiraled out of her hands. "It's probably a mistake," Evelyn said, her voice tighter than she intended. "These tests, like you said, they're not always right." Her eyes darted to the window, as if hoping to find an escape route. Olivia wasn't buying it. "Come on, Grandma," she said, her eyes narrowing just a little. "A parent-child match? That's not some second cousin twice removed." She folded her arms, her posture shifting from playful curiosity to something more serious. "You're acting weird, Grandma. You're never like this." Evelyn shook her head, forcing a weak laugh. "I'm old, Olivia. Old people get weird sometimes." But the joke didn't land. Not this time. Olivia's eyes stayed on her, sharp and unyielding. Evelyn felt it like a spotlight she couldn't step out of. The room felt too small. She needed space. Her heart thudded in her chest, the weight of it pressing down on her ribs. "I think I'll go check on my roses," Evelyn said suddenly, pushing herself up from the chair with more effort than usual. Her legs felt stiff, her movements awkward. She walked toward the back door, each step feeling like it took twice the energy it should. Olivia watched her go, her eyes full of questions but her mouth saying nothing. As soon as Evelyn stepped outside, she inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. Her garden was her sanctuary, a place where nothing could follow her unless she let it. She knelt by the rose bushes, her knees pressing into the soft dirt. Her hands hovered over a rosebud, her fingers trembling slightly before they steadied. She pinched off a dead leaf, letting it fall to the ground. She took another deep breath, the familiar scent of earth and flowers grounding her, if only for a moment. Her mind, however, was anything but grounded. "It's not possible," she muttered under her breath, her fingers brushing over the petals of a fully bloomed rose. "It's not possible." But of course it was possible. The past had a way of doing that, staying quiet until it didn't. She had done everything right. She'd lived a good life. She'd raised her kids. She'd loved her grandchildren. She'd gone to church, cooked family dinners, and kept her secrets buried so deep that she had convinced herself they'd stay that way. But now here it was, rising up like a sun she couldn't stop from rising. The old memories came rushing back like floodwaters breaking through a dam. She thought of him, the man she loved when she was just a girl. She remembered the way he smiled at her from across the diner counter, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. She remembered how they swore they'd run away together. But things didn't work out that way, did they? Her mother had found out. And in those days, things like that didn't just work out. It was shameful. It was hidden. And it was taken from her. Her chest tightened as she remembered that hospital room. The nurse who wouldn't look her in the eyes. The sound of a baby's cry, then nothing. "It's for the best, Evelyn," her mother had said, squeezing her arm as they walked away. "He'll have a better life with someone else." Evelyn had never spoken about it again. "Grandma!" Olivia's voice rang out from the back porch. Evelyn stiffened, her hand still gripping the stem of the rose, thorns pressing into her fingers. She loosened her grip, glancing over her shoulder. Olivia stepped down from the porch, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were scanning Evelyn like she was trying to read a mystery novel. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, concern etched on her face. Evelyn forced herself to smile, turning her face toward her granddaughter. "Of course I am," she said, brushing her hands together like she was just shaking off dirt. Olivia didn't look convinced. She took a few steps closer, squinting at her grandmother the way she did when she was trying to solve a puzzle. "I messaged them," Olivia said, her tone careful but firm. "The person in the DNA test. I messaged them just to see." Evelyn's heart dropped so hard she swore she could hear it hit the ground. "You did what?" Evelyn's voice came out louder than she intended. Olivia took a small step back, eyes wide with surprise. "I just thought it would be cool to see who they are," she said defensively. "You always tell me to be curious about life." Evelyn's eyes darted from Olivia to the house, her mind spinning. She could feel the thin threads of control unraveling. Her breathing grew shallow, and her gaze darted around the yard like she could spot the problem if she just looked hard enough. "You shouldn't have done that, Olivia," Evelyn said, her voice sharper than she'd ever used with her granddaughter. Olivia flinched. "Grandma, what's the big deal?" "It's just a message." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "You don't understand," she said quietly, the words coming out like she was forcing them through a locked door. Olivia tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Then help me understand," she said softly. "Please, Grandma, you're scaring me." Evelyn felt her chest tighten again, but it wasn't from panic this time. It was from something deeper, something older. She stared at Olivia, her granddaughter's eyes so full of love and patience, and she saw a version of herself from so many years ago, young, hopeful, and trusting the world to be kind. She sighed, her shoulders sinking as if the weight of it all had finally caught up to her. She looked down at her hands, the wrinkles on her knuckles, the faint scars she got from gardening last summer. She knew this moment would come eventually. It had just come 50 years later than she expected. She wiped her hands on her apron, then reached up to touch the gold locket around her neck again. "Olivia," she said quietly, her eyes meeting her granddaughter's. Her voice was steady now, like she'd made a decision. "There's something I need to tell you. But once I do, things might never be the same." Evelyn sat at the kitchen table that night long after Olivia had gone home. The house was silent, save for the slow ticking of the old wall clock above the stove. The dim glow of the single kitchen light left long, soft shadows on the walls, and everything felt too still, too quiet, like the calm before a thunderstorm. She sat with her elbows on the table, hands clasped together under her chin, eyes fixed on the locket hanging from her neck. Her thumb traced over the surface of the gold heart-shaped pendant, worn smooth after decades of absent-minded touch. Her mother had given her this locket the same day she'd walked out of that hospital. Something to hold on to, her mother had said, placing it around Evelyn's neck. The past belongs to God now, Evelyn. Leave it with him. Her mother's words had echoed in her mind for years, a shield against questions she never wanted to answer. But shields don't last forever. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, the screen lighting up with a glow that seemed unnaturally bright in the darkroom. Her breath caught in her chest. She knew what it was. She didn't want to know, but she knew. Her eyes flicked to the phone. It buzzed again. A notification from the DNA testing app. You have a new message from your DNA match. Evelyn's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would shake her ribs loose. Her fingers hovered over the phone, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. Don't open it, Evelyn, she muttered to herself, shaking her head slowly. Don't open it, girl. You know where this road goes. But the temptation was unbearable. She wasn't that young girl anymore, but something about that message made her feel 17 again. Powerless, afraid, and carrying the weight of secrets that didn't feel like hers to carry. Her fingers moved before her mind could stop them. She swiped up, tapped the message, and it opened with a soft click. Hi, I hope this message finds you well. I'm not sure how to start this, but I think I might be your child. I know this might be a shock, but I would really love to connect if you're open to it. My name is Marcus. Her breath hitched. She blinked hard, her eyes stinging with a thread of tears she didn't want to shed. She sat frozen, staring at the name like it had weight, like it was something she could reach out and hold. Marcus. She hadn't expected a name. She hadn't expected it to feel so real. Her fingers hovered over the phone as if it might burn her if she touched it. She could feel the old memories clawing their way back up from the place she had buried them. She remembered the way the nurse had carried him away, wrapped in a blue blanket. She hadn't even been allowed to hold him. Don't get attached, her mother had said. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Evelyn set the phone down as if it were a bomb ticking down to zero. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight. She pressed her fingers to her temples, rubbing slow, small circles to steady herself. Her mind swirled with emotions she hadn't felt in years. Grief, shame, fear, but also something else. Something she didn't want to name. Hope. She hadn't known that door was still there, much less that it could be opened. She'd been a good mother to her children. She'd raised them with everything she had, and she'd promised herself that she'd done her best to move on. But now he was here, reaching out to her from across the void of time. My name is Marcus. She closed her eyes, the name repeating over and over in her mind, the voice of the girl she used to be whispering softly. What if? She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound loud and sharp in the still house. Her breathing was heavier now, and she paced the small kitchen, rubbing her hands together like she was trying to wash something off that wouldn't come clean. She glanced at the phone on the table. Don't do it, Evelyn, she muttered, her voice breaking. But she already knew she would. The past never knocks on your door without letting itself in. She snatched up the phone, her hands trembling, and typed slowly, each letter heavier than the last. Hello, Marcus. This is Evelyn. I think you're right. I think we should talk. Her thumb hovered over the send button. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed it. The message sent. There was no taking it back now. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual, her eyes opening before the sun had risen. The weight in her chest was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the weight of dread. It was the weight of waiting. Her eyes glanced at the phone on the nightstand. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she got up, washed her face, and put on her favorite blue cardigan. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman preparing for something she couldn't name but knew was coming. She went outside to water her roses, feeling the cool air nip at her skin. The sun hadn't fully broken over the horizon, but the soft glow of dawn stretched across the sky in streaks of pink and orange. Her hands worked on autopilot, tending to each rose with care. The thorns scratched her fingers, but she didn't flinch. Pain was something she'd learned to live with. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood back, looking at the roses as if seeing them for the first time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly before pulling it out. "Marcus, thank you for responding. I can't believe I'm talking to you. I have so many questions. I've wondered about you my whole life. I hope you're open to talking more. Here's my number if you'd rather call." Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her whole body felt heavy, like she just carried a suitcase up a flight of stairs. She sat down on the porch swing, letting it sway slowly beneath her. Her eyes scanned the message over and over. "I've wondered about you my whole life." She stared at those words until they blurred. Her fingers hovered over the phone's call button. Her thumb brushed against it, but she didn't press it. She didn't press it because she knew once she did, she'd have to face everything she'd buried. The door creaked open behind her. She glanced back and saw Olivia stepping outside, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. "Hey, Grandma," Olivia said softly, her eyes filled with sleep but still alert. She sat next to Evelyn, her shoulder close enough to touch. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just watched the sky as it slowly turned from pink to pale blue. "Did they message you back?" Olivia asked quietly, her voice hesitant. Evelyn glanced at her, surprised at how perceptive she was. She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, her voice raspier than usual. Olivia nodded, staring out at the horizon. "Are you going to call them?" she asked, her eyes still on the sky. Evelyn sighed, her gaze distant but steady. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I'm thinking about it." Olivia glanced at her, her eyes soft with understanding. "It's okay, Grandma. You don't have to decide today." Evelyn smiled faintly, her lips curling just slightly at the corners. She placed her hand on Olivia's, squeezing it gently. "I know, baby," she said, her voice full of love and exhaustion. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the birds chirp in the distance. Evelyn's gaze fell to the phone still in her lap. "I've wondered about you my whole life." The words echoed in her mind, louder than the birdsong, louder than the creak of the swing, louder than the steady beat of her heart. She knew she couldn't stay on this porch forever. She knew that once the past comes knocking, it doesn't stop until you answer. Her thumb hovered over Marcus's number. Her eyes flicked to Olivia, her granddaughter, who sat quietly sipping her coffee, calm and steady as always. "I've wondered about you my whole life." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing down on the call button before she could stop herself. The phone rang once, twice. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. On the third ring, a voice came through. "Hello." Evelyn froze. The voice was deep, warm, and familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips parting in a shaky breath. "Hi," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "It's me." "Hello." The voice on the other end of the line was steady but cautious, like a man answering a call from a number he wasn't sure he should trust. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, as if the weight of 5 decades had suddenly settled on her vocal cords. She gripped the phone like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Say something, Evelyn, say something," she thought, but her mouth wouldn't cooperate. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy, until the voice spoke again, softer this time. Is this Evelyn?" Her breath shuddered as it left her lungs, and she blinked rapidly to clear her vision. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "Yes," she said, her heart thumping in her ears. "Yes, it's me." She heard a sharp inhale on the other end, followed by a long pause. Time seemed to stretch, her mind racing through every possible outcome of this moment. She braced herself for questions, for accusations, for things she wasn't sure she had the strength to answer. But what she heard next was something she hadn't prepared for. "I've been waiting for this call my whole life," Marcus said, his voice cracking with emotion. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. Her eyes closed tight, and her head tilted back against the porch swing. Tears she didn't know she'd been holding in slipped down her cheeks, warm and unstoppable. She covered her mouth with one hand, letting out a quiet, shaky breath. "I didn't think I'd ever hear your voice," Marcus continued, and she could hear it now, the raw, unfiltered ache in his words. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me." Her voice was shaky, like an old chair with loose legs. "I didn't know you'd be looking," she admitted, her eyes staring at a patch of dirt near the edge of the porch. She traced a crack in the wood with her thumb, grounding herself in the present moment. "I thought," she stopped, letting the words hang there. "I thought you had a good life. I told myself that if you had a good life, there was no reason to go back." There was silence on the other end, and Evelyn's heart twisted with fear. She'd lived long enough to know how silence could be more powerful than any words. But after a moment, Marcus spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I did have a good life," he said quietly, "but I always knew something was missing." Evelyn bit her bottom lip, her eyes squeezing shut as fresh tears streamed down her face. "You weren't missing anything," she whispered, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "You had parents, you had love." "I did," Marcus agreed. "But I always wondered about you." "About why?" Her body stiffened. "Why?" The one word she had dreaded for 50 years. Her breath grew shallow, and she felt that familiar, crushing pressure in her chest, the weight of the choice she had made. Her hand found the locket at her neck again, her fingers gripping it tight. She didn't have to open it to know what was inside. A small photo, yellowed from age, of a baby boy she had never seen again. She had placed it there on the night she came home from the hospital, vowing never to open it again. She thought about what her mother had told her that day. "Sometimes love means letting go, Evelyn. Sometimes love means not looking back." But her mother was wrong. She'd never stopped looking back. "It wasn't my choice," Evelyn said quietly, her voice strained like an old door hinge. Her words felt fragile, like something that might break if she said them too loud. She heard Marcus shift on the other end of the line. He didn't say anything right away, which made her feel the need to fill the silence. "I didn't want to," she continued, her voice breaking as the memories clawed their way up. "I was 17. My mother said it was for the best. They took you before I could hold you. I didn't even get to hold you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together to keep from sobbing. "I didn't know," Marcus said softly. His voice sounded distant, but she could hear the shift in his breathing, like he was swallowing back his own emotions. I thought maybe you didn't want me." Evelyn's eyes shot open, and her body jolted forward, as if the words had physically struck her. "No," she said, her voice fierce, louder than she'd intended. "No, baby, no. It was never that." Her heart felt like it was being wrung out, twisted and pulled until it had no shape left. "You were never unwanted. Never." She pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could steady the storm inside her. "I loved you from the minute I knew you existed. I loved you then, and I love you now. I never stopped." Silence. Just the quiet hum of the phone line. Evelyn sat there, clutching the phone to her ear, feeling like she'd said too much. But then she heard it. A sniffle. Then another. And then softly, Marcus spoke again. "I'm glad you told me that," he said, his voice thick with tears. "I've been waiting my whole life to hear that." Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping it now. Every feeling she'd buried, every painful night of wondering where he was, if he was happy, if he was safe, it all came pouring out in heaving, gasping breaths. Her tears soaked the collar of her cardigan. She didn't care. For the first time in 50 years, she didn't feel like she had to carry it all alone. "Where are you, Marcus?" she asked suddenly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her cardigan. "Where do you live?" "I'm in Chicago," he said, his voice steadier now. "Been here for years. Got a little family of my own now." Her heart swelled and ached at the same time. He had a family. He had children. Her grandchildren. The weight of it all hit her at once, and her breath hitched in her chest. She was a grandmother to children she'd never met. Her fingers pressed harder into her locket. She could feel the small picture inside. A child then, but a man now. A father. Do you think we could meet one day?" Marcus asked cautiously, his words careful, like he didn't want to push too hard. Evelyn nodded before she even realized she was nodding. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, we can meet." Her voice didn't waver this time. It was steady, like a bridge finally built after years of neglect. "I want to meet you, Marcus. I want to meet all of you." "All of me?" he asked, confusion in his voice. "Your family," Evelyn clarified, her smile returning slowly, softly. "My grandchildren." She could hear Marcus's breath catch. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment she wondered if she'd said too much. But then he let out a small laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that comes after a long cry, light, shaky, and full of relief. "I like that," he said, his voice warm. "I'd like that a lot." They sat on the phone for an hour after that, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus told her about his childhood, his family, and the life he'd built. She told him stories about her roses, about Olivia, about the times she wished she could have searched for him but didn't know how. The years that had once felt like a wall between them now felt like something they could climb together. For the first time in a long, long time, Evelyn didn't feel like she was running from her past. She was walking toward it. As she sat on the porch swing, the sun fully risen now, she felt warmth on her face. Her gaze drifted to the roses, their petals catching the golden glow of the sun. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her heart was still heavy, but it wasn't the same kind of weight. It was fuller now, like something that had been emptied long ago had finally been filled. Evelyn sat at the head of the dining room table, her eyes scanning the familiar faces of her family. Her daughter Cheryl sat across from her, arms folded tightly across her chest like she was physically holding something in. Cheryl's husband, David, sat beside her, glancing between Evelyn and Cheryl with quiet caution. To Evelyn's left was her youngest son, Mark, who leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting to the clock every few seconds like he had somewhere better to be. Olivia sat next to him, glancing nervously from her phone to Evelyn, her lips pressed into a thin line. The warm glow of the chandelier bathed them all in soft yellow light, but the room felt colder than it had in years. Evelyn's hands lay flat on the table, her palms pressed down as if she were trying to keep herself steady. "I need to tell you all something," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Her eyes flicked to Cheryl, her oldest child, and then to Mark. Neither of them looked at her directly. Her heart squeezed in her chest. They're already bracing for it, she thought. They know something is coming. She took a breath, her fingers curling into the edge of the table. "It's about the DNA test Olivia had me do," she continued, her voice steady but quiet. Olivia glanced up from her phone, her eyes locking on Evelyn. Cheryl raised an eyebrow, her posture shifting, more alert now. "What about it?" Cheryl asked, suspicion sharp in her voice. Her eyes scanned her mother like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Did it say we're part Viking or something? She added with a forced, dry laugh. Mark snorted but kept scrolling on his phone, uninterested. Evelyn's eyes darted toward Olivia, who was watching her with a mix of encouragement and quiet worry. Her granddaughter gave a small, subtle nod, as if to say, "You've got this." Evelyn nodded back. "No, it wasn't about that," she said, and her voice grew tighter. She knew there was no way to say it without cracking something wide open. It found someone. The room went still. No one moved, not even Mark, whose thumb hovered mid-swipe on his phone. Cheryl's eyes narrowed slowly, her brows drawing together. "What do you mean, it found someone?" Cheryl said, each word sharp and deliberate, like she already knew where this was headed but needed to hear it anyway. Evelyn exhaled through her nose, feeling heat rise in her chest. She kept her eyes on the table for a moment longer before forcing herself to look up. "It found a match," she said, her words careful, deliberate. Her throat felt dry, like she'd swallowed a mouthful of sand. "It connected me with someone I knew a long time ago." Cheryl tilted her head, her eyes squinting like she was staring at something she didn't recognize. "Someone you knew," she repeated slowly. Then, realization dawned on her face. Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned forward, her arms unfolding as she placed her hands flat on the table. "Are you saying it's some kind of old boyfriend or something?" Cheryl asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Her husband, David, glanced at her, his eyebrows raised. Evelyn shook her head, her gaze steady now, her eyes fixed on Cheryl. "No," she said firmly, feeling a weight pressed down on her chest. She took a breath. It found my child." The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of shock slamming into every person at the table. The soft hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening. Olivia's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, even though she already knew. Cheryl leaned back slowly, her face frozen in a mask of confusion. Mark sat up straight, his phone forgotten in his hand. His eyes darted from Evelyn to Cheryl, his mouth hanging open. "What did you just say?" Cheryl's voice was low and dangerous, like a distant rumble of thunder. Evelyn could feel the anger rising in her daughter, sharp as a storm about to break. "I had a child," Evelyn said again, her voice more certain this time. "Before I had any of you. I was young, 17. My mother, she made me give him up." Her hands pressed harder into the table as she said it, as if bracing for impact. "I didn't have a choice, Cheryl. I didn't want to let him go." Her voice cracked on the last few words, and she saw Cheryl's eyes narrow, her face hardening into something sharp and unyielding. Cheryl's lips parted in disbelief. "So, what? You just had a secret child out there somewhere, and you never thought to tell us." Her voice rose with every word, her tone edged with betrayal. "You told me everything about how to be a good mother, but you didn't think this was important enough to share?" She sat forward, her hands slamming down on the table. "How could you not tell us this, Mom?" "Because I was ashamed." Evelyn snapped, her voice louder than she'd intended. The room went still again. She hadn't meant to raise her voice, but it was out now, sharp and raw in the open air. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. "I was ashamed, Cheryl. My mother told me it was a mistake, and I believed her. I was 17. What did I know about fighting back?" Her voice broke, and she wiped her face with a trembling hand. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd think less of me." "Think less of you?" Cheryl repeated, her eyes wild with disbelief. "Mom, you raised us to believe in honesty and family, and you sat on this secret for 50 years? Her voice was sharp now, every word slicing the air between them. "We could have known him, Mom. We could have known him. Did you even think about that?" Cheryl stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She paced to the window, her arms crossed, her back to Evelyn. Her breathing was loud, shallow. "I can't believe this," she muttered, shaking her head. "I can't believe this." "Cheryl, please," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with exhaustion. "I know you're angry, baby, but I didn't have a way to fix it back then. I didn't have the power to change it." Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her eyes again. "I know I should have told you. I know. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how to carry it and still be your mother at the same time." Mark cleared his throat, his eyes darting from Cheryl to Evelyn. "So, what happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice unsure. Is he gonna come here?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her gaze steady but sad. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is Marcus. He's my son, and I want you to meet him." "I'm not ready for this," Cheryl muttered from the window, her arms still tightly crossed. She turned, her eyes red with frustration. "You're just springing this on us like it's nothing. Like, hey, guess what? You have a brother." She threw up her hands. "Do you know what that does to people, Mom? Do you?" "I do," Evelyn said, her voice steady but filled with quiet pain. "I know exactly what it does because I've carried it for 50 years. Cheryl's face twisted in anger, but something in Evelyn's voice stopped her from speaking. Her eyes softened just a little. No one spoke for a while after that. The only sound was the soft clinking of Olivia's spoon as she stirred the sugar into her tea. Cheryl stared at her mother with eyes that were hard but no longer sharp. She rubbed her hands together slowly, glancing at the door, then back at Evelyn. "He's coming here?" she asked again, quieter this time. "Yes," Evelyn said firmly. "He's coming here." Cheryl shook her head, rubbing the bridge of her nose like she was warding off a headache. She let out a long, slow breath and sat back down, staring at her mother for a long time. "I'm still mad at you," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I know," Evelyn replied softly. "You have every right to be." They sat in silence, broken but not beyond repair. The weight of everything hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. The sun was setting low in the sky, casting golden streaks of light through the living room windows. Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers nervously tapping against her knees. She glanced at the clock on the wall for the fourth time in the last minute. 5:47 p.m. Marcus was supposed to arrive at 6 o'clock. Her heart had been pounding since the moment she woke up, and it hadn't let up since. Her hands felt clammy, and her breath came in shallow, uneven draws. She hated this feeling, the same feeling she'd had at 17 when she sat in that hospital room, waiting for something she couldn't control. Only this time, she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a grown woman, a mother, a grandmother, and she was determined to face what was coming head-on. From the kitchen, the clattering of dishes echoed as Cheryl moved around with a little too much force. It was her way of showing she was still upset. Every slammed cupboard door and sharp clink of glass was a quiet protest. Evelyn glanced in that direction, but didn't say anything. She'd learned long ago that some storms you had to let pass on their own. Olivia sat beside her, scrolling on her phone, but her eyes weren't really on the screen. Every few seconds, she glanced at Evelyn, her gaze full of quiet support. Olivia reached over and placed a hand on Evelyn's knee. "You're doing great, Grandma," she said softly, flashing a small, reassuring smile. Evelyn smiled back, but it was thin, stretched too tight to feel real. Her phone buzzed on the armrest next to her. She snatched it up quickly, her eyes locking onto the screen. "Here." That was all it said, but it was enough to send a shock of electricity through her entire body. She felt a ripple of nerves surge through her fingers as she gripped the phone tighter. "He's here," Evelyn announced, her voice tight but firm. Cheryl's clattering stopped. Silence. Evelyn heard her daughter's sharp inhale from the kitchen, but Cheryl didn't say a word. Olivia stood up, brushing invisible lint off her pants. "I'll get the door," Olivia offered, already walking toward the front door. Evelyn stood slowly, her knees stiff from the weight of everything she was carrying. Her heart felt like it was thudding against her ribs, not from fear, but from anticipation. She heard Olivia unlatch the door, and her breath caught in her throat. It was suddenly too real. The quiet creak of the front door opening sounded like thunder. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the doorway, and she froze when she saw him. He was taller than she'd expected. Broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and a beard that was neatly lined along his jaw. He wore a gray button-down shirt and dark jeans, simple but clean. His eyes, those eyes, hit her like a train. They were the same eyes she'd seen in the mirror every day for 72 years. Deep brown, almond-shaped, with that soft, gentle look that she always told herself was her own. Now she was looking at them on someone else's face. On his face. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice softer than she expected, his eyes searching hers like he was looking for something familiar. Her breath hitched. She couldn't move. Her fingers were gripping the back of the couch, her knuckles white from the pressure. She felt like she was 17 again, standing in that hospital hallway, hoping for one more look. But this time, he wasn't being carried away. This time, he had come to her. Her lips trembled, and her body swayed forward before she could stop herself. One step, then another. And then she was in front of him, her eyes filling with tears faster than she could blink them away. "Marcus," she breathed, his name barely a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might scare him away. She lifted her hand, her fingers shaking as she reached toward him, unsure if she was allowed to touch him, unsure if she had the right. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached out too, and their hands met in the space between them, his large, warm hand wrapping around hers like it had always been there. "Hi, Mama," he said, his voice cracking just a little. That was it. That was all it took. Evelyn sobbed, her face crumbling as she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold it in but failing. She pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapping around him tight, tighter than she'd ever hugged anyone in her life. Her head rested against his chest, and she felt him hug her back, just as strong. His arms were solid, firm, real. She felt his heartbeat steady and strong, and for the first time in 50 years, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She was home. Cheryl stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms still folded, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Marcus. Her face was hard, but her eyes weren't. Evelyn could see it. She could see the hurt beneath the anger, confusion beneath the pride. Cheryl glanced at Olivia, who gave her a small nudge with her elbow. "Go on," Olivia whispered. Cheryl frowned, glancing away, but she didn't leave. She stayed. That was enough for now. "Come in, baby," Evelyn said as she pulled away from Marcus, still holding his hand like she was afraid to let go. "Come in, sit down. Let me get a good look at you." Her eyes scanned his face, soaking in every detail. The way his smile tilted just a little higher on the left, the dimple in his cheek, the curve of his nose that looked just like hers. "Handsome," she said, wiping tears from her eyes, laughing softly. "Look at you. Handsome as ever." Marcus grinned, glancing at the ground, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's all you, Mama," he said with a smile that was warm, real, and filled with something Evelyn didn't expect. Pride. He stepped inside, and Olivia closed the door behind him. Cheryl watched him closely, her eyes sharp, her lips pressed together. Evelyn noticed it right away. "Cheryl," she said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a warm breeze. Cheryl glanced at her. "This is Marcus. Your brother." Her words were slow and deliberate, like she was making sure Cheryl heard every one of them. Cheryl's eyes shifted to Marcus, scanning him like she was looking for something to latch onto. "Half-brother," Cheryl said sharply, her tone colder than ice. The room went quiet. Marcus glanced at Evelyn, but she didn't look away from Cheryl. "No," Evelyn said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Whole brother. Blood is blood, Cheryl. It always has been." Cheryl blinked, stunned by the weight of her mother's words. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flickering to Marcus, then back to Evelyn. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. But then Cheryl let out a sharp breath and shook her head. "Fine," she muttered, stepping forward. Her eyes met Marcus's, and her jaw tensed. "Welcome to the family, I guess." Her tone was rough, but she held out her hand. Marcus took it with a small smile, shaking it firmly. "Thanks, sis," Marcus said with a grin. Cheryl's eyes flickered at the word sis, but she didn't correct him. Not this time. Later that night, after everyone had left, Evelyn sat by herself in the living room, the house quiet again. Her phone buzzed on the table. A new message from Marcus. "Thanks for today. I needed it more than you know." Her lips curled into a soft smile. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed back. "Me too, baby. Me too." Her gaze shifted to the roses outside her window, their petals glowing softly in the light of the street lamp. They'd been through storms, those roses. Harsh winds, cold winters, rain that beat them down. But every spring, they bloomed again. Bright, beautiful, whole. Evelyn leaned back, resting her head against the chair, her heart full but steady. The past was no longer something she had to bury. It was something she could plan, water, and watch bloom.